Hi, welcome back. So, if you've been following me, I've been doing the real estate course through Humber, and I've just finished the first simulation session. And to be honest, it was pretty easy. If you pay attention to it in class, like you do have to participate in class, obviously, and you pay attention, you'll definitely pass this exam as well. Um, it was a bit annoying waking up early in the morning and then going like sitting the whole day and just talking on Zoom. It was like a bit annoying for me, but it wasn't that bad actually. I'm making it seem like it was the worst week of my life, but it wasn't. All right, so I'm just gonna summarize the 4 days that you are actually gonna learn. Whatever you're gonna learn, I'm just gonna summarize it quickly. So if you want, you could just listen to these notes, and then 100% sure you will pass the simulation. All right, so there's about um, 20, 25 questions that you need to be able to answer. So I'm just gonna go over them. Okay. So first of all, why is it important to have an initial conversation with the seller? So what is an initial conversation? You'll learn that in the course. So to have this conversation, you make them make the seller aware of the brokerage and the salesperson's obligation to them, to avoid misunderstanding, to ensure an agency relationship is not unintentionally created, to comply with Reba, and to allow them to make an educated decision regarding the level of service they would like to receive from you. Okay, so the initial conversation should cover services, differences between client and customer services, different services that the brokerage will provide on duties and obligations, your obligation as a salesperson, and the broker's obligation and the seller's obligation. So why is it important to explain multiple representation to a seller? So we can avoid misunderstandings. That's why it's important. Explain how the brokerage will operate under multiple representation, and because you have to comply with Reba. Third question is, why is it important to document seller representation? It is because you have to properly set sellers' expectations about your responsibilities. So you have to inform them of your obligation and of their obligation and your obligations under the agreement. Obviously, comply with Reba, and so what you should do is put the agreement in writing and sign on behalf of the brokerage, and ask the seller to sign. Question number 4, why is it, what are the steps to documenting a customer relationship with the seller? So basically, explain the customer service agreement to them and confirm that they understand the agreement before you sign it. Put the agreement in writing and make sure the seller signs it as per Reba. So what are some key advertising guidelines that you must follow? So basically, you have to comply with Reba. So everything you do, you have to comply with Reba. So that's one of the main things. Okay, I'm saying it over and over again, but it's because it's important. If you don't comply with Reba, you'll be fined, or you could have your license taken away from you. That's because it's that serious. So back to the topic. What are some of the important guidelines that you must follow regarding advertising? Regardless of what media is being used, your information must appear as identification of the registrant, so your name, identification of the registration status, identification of the brokerage, and identification that the brokerage is a brokerage. And so Reba actually prohibits you for knowingly making an inaccurate representation in respect to the services that you will provide and respect to the trade of real estate. Just make sure you follow the guidelines. And another question is, moving on to a different topic. So, what are the key items to remember when documenting your relationship with the buyer client? So, make sure you explain the pre-printed clauses completely and accurately to the buyer. Confirm the buyer's understanding of the explanations and put the agreement in writing. And make sure you comply with Reba. What are some important ways to help a buyer with the qualification process and selecting properties that meet their criteria? So you want to be able to ask them questions to determine what the buyer needs and wants and what their financial capacity is. And some of the questions, qualifications that can help you determine that is the price range they're looking for, the property type they're looking for, and if any important features that they need or want. And make sure you recommend the buyer obtain a pre-approval with their lender. And what is the purpose of adding a clause to a buyer's offer? So clauses selected should address issues and concerns for the buyer and the property in order to promote and protect the best interest for a buyer. So basically, you want to add appropriate clauses and ensure the offer's details are complete and accurate to avoid any legal issues in the future. You want to protect and promote the buyer's best interest and address any issues and concerns that the buyer may have about the property and ensure the offer details are complete and accurate to avoid any legal issues in the future. I said that twice because that's very important. You do not want to be in a legal action, legal issue in the future, because I don't know if you had a speeding ticket, that even fighting a speeding ticket is a hassle. So I don't know how you would deal with this type of legal issue. Okay, sorry, back to the topic. What are some of the responsibilities for you in preparing the offer and disclosure document? So when preparing the offer, remember, proper preparation of the offer can avoid problems, so make sure everything is prepared properly. Adapt a basic structure to address differing circumstances. Disclosure document to the fully explain the disclosure document to the buyers and confirm their understanding, and clearly communicate provisions regarding representation and remuneration arrangements prior to explaining the offer. Guide the buyer through initialing, signing, and dating relevant fields to ensure the offer and disclosure document is completed accurately. You want to exercise skill and care when explaining to offer to comply with Reba. Fully explain and confirm the buyer's understanding. If the buyer signs a document that they have misinterpreted or don't fully understand, they may be agreeing to terms that they're not aware of. Okay, so you want to make sure that you are making sure that they fully understand the terms they're signing for, which such conditions may not be favorable to them. Okay. And what does the disclosure document do? Basically, it informs the buyer of the brokerage relationship with the parties in the transaction. It explains who is paying remuneration to the cooperating brokerage and explains how much will be paid. It must be signed at the earliest opportunity and before the offer is presented, and it is also used to obtain written consent for multiple representation. So make sure you get that disclosure document signed before you have any offers on the table. What are some important aspects that a buyer should consider about counteroffer? So basically, the salesperson must ensure the buyer understands that it is their decision to accept, counter, or reject the offer. If they accept the offer, let me say that again. It is if their decision is to accept the counter offer, they will have an accepted agreement with the seller and have agreed to the seller's changes. If their decision is to counter the seller's counter offer, it will result in a new offer, and the seller may choose to work with another offer from a new buyer rather than their offer. That if their decision is rejected by the seller's counter offer, it will result in the offer being at an end. So main things your buyer should know is basically they can accept, counter, or reject the offer. What else? So what are some things that you should advise the buyer to consider in competing offer situation? Basically, you should offer advice on the offer price, deposit, financing, property inspection, other conditions, irrevocable date, completion date, and schedules and fixtures. What should you do when presenting competing offers to a buyer? Basically, advise the offer that an offer meeting or exceeding the asking price will not guarantee the seller will accept the offer, as the other factors may influence the seller's decision, as completion date, no conditions. Make the buyer aware that once an offer without any conditions is accepted, it becomes a binding contract and they are bound to the terms and conditions. What is the purpose of explaining an offer to the seller? Basically, ensure the seller understands the offer they have received. Ensure that the clauses in the offer are favorable to the seller. Okay, moving on to I think there's like 2 or 3 more questions that you need to know about. What are some of the things that you should advise the seller to consider in competing offer situation? I would say make sure the seller can make an informed decision based on the advantages and disadvantages of each offer. Options available are basically accepting, countering, or rejecting. Basically, that's it. What are your obligations under Reba when dealing with multiple representation? Okay, so basically disclose the scope and limitations of your service prior to the offer being presented. The brokerage must disclose that the brokerage is in multiple representation to the seller and the buyer, disclosing in writing the nature of the brokerage relationship with the buyer or seller, and seller obtain the written consent of a buyer and seller. So that is your obligation under Reba. Make sure you disclose if you are in a multiple representation. What are your obligations under Reba when dealing with an agreement to reduce remuneration during competing offers? Basically, you have the obligation to disclose any remuneration reduction or rebate to all buyers. You must also disclose the details of remuneration rebate and rebate to all buyers. Under what circumstances should a listing salesperson disclose information to all buyers during competing offers? So what does that even mean? Basically, during competing offers, the listing salesperson must disclose to all buyers when each salesperson from the same brokerage have registered competing offers. So basically what this means is you have to let, let's say a person from brokerage A has a buyer, and they put in an offer to the seller, and a different salesperson in a different city also works with a brokerage A but a different location, puts in an offer. That basically means the brokerage will be in a multiple representation. Am I making sense? I think I am. Yeah. So if a seller's salesperson comes to find out that 2 people from the same brokerage putting in the offer, he has to let the salesperson know from that brokerage that they are in a multiple representation and they should figure their situation out beforehand. Okay? Because sometimes a salesperson from a different city, they might be working at the same brokerage but in different locations. They might not know that a salesperson from a branch A already put in an offer, right? So you have to let the salesperson has to let the buyer's salesperson know that they're in a multiple representation. Okay, just a little bit more. What should you do to keep in mind when drafting a counter offer for a seller? Basically, make sure it's valid and capable of being accepted. It reflects the seller's instructions, and the wording is clear and precise to avoid misunderstandings. Ensure the seller initials everything. And yeah, what should you keep in mind when using a waiver or fulfillment of conditions? Since it appears that both notice of fulfillment of conditions and waiver achieve the same results, using an inappropriate form can cause misunderstandings at a later stage. Make the buyer aware of the risks of waiving a condition to them, so they can make a informed decision. Exercise caution, and that is pretty much it. Next question: what should you keep in mind when using an amendment to an agreement? An amendment is used to make changes to an agreement of purchase and sale after it has been accepted. An amendment must be mutually agreed upon and signed by all parties to the agreement. What is important when using a notice of fulfillment and waiver? If someone waives a condition, they are simply stating they no longer require conditional protection in the agreement. They are proceeding with the transaction even if the condition has not been satisfied. A notice of fulfillment is used to advise the other party that due diligence as contemplated by the condition has been carried out and is satisfied, and they are proceeding with the transaction. Next question is basically, what should you keep in mind when using mutual release and termination forms? Use a mutual release and know when to use a termination to ensure the proper procedures have been carried out when a transaction is not proceeding. When using a mutual release and termination forms, when a transaction will not be proceeding, a mutual release must be completed and signed by all parties for the deposit to be disbursed from the brokerage's trust account. A mutual release will also release all parties to the transaction from their obligation and liabilities. A termination by the buyer and seller is used to provide a written notice to terminate the agreement within the time period in a subsequent condition. Okay, the last question I have here is, what is your role as a buyer's salesperson after the agreement is firm and binding? Your role is to address any concerns or questions the buyer may have. Make sure any additional terms and terms agreed to in the offer are completed prior to the transaction closing. Resolve any last-minute issues that may arise on closing date before they escalate into a problem quickly. Refer the buyer to their lawyer if there are any issues to the salesperson that salesperson cannot resolve. Sorry, I need some water. Okay, that was simulation 1. It's pretty easy. You do have to sit through class for 5 days, but that's something you have to do because I think attendance is part of the mark, and the test was super easy. I am 100% sure you're gonna pass. And that is it for me. Hope this helped, and that's it. Have a good night. Bye.